Hi, welcome to Week in Review. I'm Phil O'Connor, the Live Enterprise Director, joined again this week by a great crew. We got Dale Denwalt from our Capitol Bureau, Justin Wingirter from our Watchdog Desk, and my old friend, the business editor, Don Mecoy. Justin, we kind of put a bow on it this week at the, Dale, we kind of put a bow on it this week at the Capitol. Finally called an end to the session, and what a session it's been.
They threw in the towel. They said, we're done, we're getting out of here. They adjourned for the year. There's a slight chance they may have to come back for a special session to deal with medical marijuana regulation if Oklahoma voters decide that's what they want. But for the most part, we won't see lawmakers again unless they show up on your campaign doorstep until they come back for session in February.
Let's talk about this session. I mean, a historic session by many measures.
It is. They wrapped everything up in 3 months. They passed a budget quicker than I've ever seen one. They also had two special sessions to deal with last year's budget. This was a remarkable and historic session for many reasons, if simply for the fact that there was so much going on that they tried to get done early because they didn't manage to get things done right the first time.
And of course, maybe the biggest story of the year, of course, the teacher strike.
Yep.
and that outcome. We got lawmakers who are going to go back home now and campaign for office after passing one of the largest tax increases in quite some time in the state in Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. What do you think the mood of the voters is? And we're talking about a Republican-dominated legislature here that, for the most part, is anti-tax.
There's still a lot of people who didn't want that tax to go into place. But for the most part, I think Oklahomans appreciate the fact that if you're going to tax them for something, that you put it towards something like a teacher pay raise, towards something like education, and towards state government that has, for the last several years especially, but for the last decade, as you'll see in a story this weekend from Randy Ellis, they cut state agencies year after year, partially because that's the policy, and in more recent years because we simply didn't have the revenue coming in.
I think a lot of people, that's one of the things they may not understand about, even with this tax increase, we are still not back at funding levels before the state went through a lot of the cuts over the previous years. So
right.
Even with this tax increase, the education funding still is behind where it was several years ago.
In raw numbers, yes.
Yeah. Another big issue that passed this year was taking up the criminal justice reform measures that stalled last year. Some of those have been approved now. Talk a little bit about what those are designed to do.
Really, they're designed to slow the growth of people heading to prison. It's not going to reduce the state prison population by any means, and but the supporters acknowledge that. But what this is an agreement with prosecutors and with the criminal justice reform advocates in the legislature and the governor to say we're going to let people have their criminal record expunged if they stay clean for 5 years without getting into trouble, if they have certain things on their record, and generally treat people who don't commit violent crimes, do more of what we can do to keep them out of prison in the first place. And so really reducing the prison sentences and the mandatory minimums that would take someone who committed a non-violent felony and put them in prison for at least 2 years. We're going to now allow judges and juries to not give them any jail time at all if that's what they want.
And this comes at a time when you have the Department of Corrections director basically saying, we need 2 brand new prisons if we don't slow this stuff down.
Right.
And it's becoming a huge part of the state budget is paying for simply the housing of what we now know is one of the nation's highest number of prisoners per capita.
That's right. And in fact, the legislature approved $116 million in bonds, mind you, but still $116 million the state is going to eventually have to repay later to upkeep and maintain the state's current prisons, including the one down in McAllister.
And one final big issue they dealt with a little bit and kind of took a swing at and made no move on was the wind energy issue. Talk a little bit about that tax credit and that issue and what the end of that was.
Right, there was a lot of last-ditch efforts to try to find another way to either tax the wind industry or to eliminate some of the incentives that it gets. Right now, projects have 10 years to get a tax credit on what they produce. If they don't use that tax credit, like if they don't produce enough to earn the tax credit, it's still eligible to them, and they can claim a refund on the tax credit that they didn't use. Basically, it's just cash the state gives to the wind companies. To the
tune of tens of millions of dollars a year.
That's right. And lawmakers try to either get rid of it outright or extend basically get rid of it, but say you can kind of collect it over the next 20 years. Kind of complicated tax law there, but really none of it passed. The wind lobby was able to succeed in blocking further implementation of cuts to the incentives that they got when they were still just a fledgling business here.
Is there anybody or would you say what maybe was the biggest disappointment of the session that didn't get done, or does anybody kind of coalesce around an idea there of this is a big issue that we did not address? Or are there too many of those?
Not really. I mean, there's always going to be something that is maybe your pet project or something you cared deeply about that you weren't able to get done. Nothing comes to the front of my mind as I'm trying to think about it, but I think people are just more excited about the fact that they can go home early and get to campaigning, because it's going to take a lot of work for conservative Republican members who voted for that tax increase. It's going to take a lot of work between now and June 26th when they stand for re-election.
Well, we hope you'll take a little bit of time off just to rest up, because we know you've been a busy man these last several weeks, and you've done a great job. So we really appreciate all your hard work on that. Justin, let's switch to a different capital. Let's go to Washington, D.C. and talk about the head of the EPA, our own Scott Pruitt.
Yep.
Guy can't seem to get out of the limelight. What's the latest on Scott Pruitt?
It's the latest it's been for weeks and months. It's a daily barrage of negative news headlines. He testified for 6 hours last week before 2 House committees. Democrats, certainly had very heated discussions with him about these controversies or scandals or whatever you want to call them that continue to build day after day. With that being said, he has the support so far of, at least tenuous support, of the only person who matters. His boss is the president, and for as long as he has the president's support, he will remain in that job. So we'll see what happens, but for now he has at least tenuous support from his boss as he takes just a daily barrage, like I said, of negative news headlines on many different fronts right now.
Talk a little bit about the story that came out this week involving his property here in Oklahoma and questions surrounding that.
Yeah, many of the controversies really surround Oklahoma or have some tie. Almost all of them do in one way or another. Most recently, this discussion of a house he bought here in Oklahoma City near the state capitol when he was a state senator. He purchased the home from a lobbyist. He purchased the home with a lobbyist. He and some other people went in on this. It was purchased at an unusually low rate, $100,000 less than it was listed to cost. So he got an unusually big discount on it. The lobbyist he bought it from then received $100,000 roughly from her employer, Southwestern Bell, now AT&T, I believe, to just make up that difference at a time when they had business before the legislature. The lobbyist he bought the home with had business before the legislature, which Pruitt then supported as a state senator. Of course, you could argue that he would have supported those measures anyway. They may have just been things that he ideologically supported, but there are some ties with lobbyists here that raise questions about just what kind of deals he was involved in, and can give the appearance of impropriety, oftentimes even when there is no impropriety to actually be had. When you get close with the lobbyists, that you have that appearance.
And he appears, at least in his testimony before Congress, unapologetic and as if nothing has been done out of the ordinary here, and kind of accuses his opponents of, I don't want to say witch hunt, but a witch hunt. But the amount of controversies and the number and the scope of what's, I mean, we have heads of government agencies who've been dismissed for far less. What is it about him that makes him so popular with the president?
Well, I think the president can understand what he's doing in his role. He has a pretty clear-cut agenda. He has a pretty clear-cut role as EPA administrator. The rollback of regulations, deregulation, is something that the president believes pretty firmly in. It's something Scott Pruitt believes pretty firmly in.
But even the rolling back of regulations, it's not like he can just universally wave a wand and roll back regulation.
True.
That is a very intensive, in some cases, years-long process to change regulation. So although he may be attempting to begin the process of rolling back regulation, it's not like he can point and say, I've rolled back a ton of regulation.
That's true. The rulemaking process in Washington does take a long time. It is tenuous and it's difficult. But he has started down that path, which is something that he can hang his hat on. It's something that conservatives have wanted in an EPA administrator for decades. So he's doing something unusual for an EPA administrator. I mean, it's either great or you hate it, depending on where you are. But I think he has a pretty clear agenda, unlike somebody like former HHS Secretary Tom Price, who was fired, had just an agenda that was probably harder for the president to really put his finger on and to understand, whereas Pruitt has a pretty clear-cut agenda. What he's doing is pretty obvious, I think, to just about everybody, and it's what the president wants. It's a deregulation agenda. So I think that probably makes his job a little safer. That being said, they just put the Senate just approved a deputy EPA administrator, Andy Wheeler, a former Inhofe aide, someone with much the same agenda. And so if Pruitt goes, there's a pretty clear backup there who would, I believe, do just about the same thing.
And you've talked to the delegation here. What do Senator Langford and Senator Inhofe say about these controversies that seem to be swirling around Pruitt?
Langford's approach has generally been to wait for these investigations to conclude. There are nearly a dozen investigations into Scott Pruitt and the EPA, the top brass at the EPA right now. So Langford's approach has generally been wait and see. Inhofe remains his defender, and this is important. I mean, Inhofe is his mentor and really kind of a political patron. If he loses Inhofe's support, he'll lose Congress's support, and it'd be a huge red flag that he's on his way out. Inhofe's support is unsurprising. It's not difficult for Pruitt to maintain that support, but it is important. I checked in with Inhofe Wednesday. I talked to him while he was downtown here in Oklahoma City, and he maintains full support of Scott Pruitt. So if he ever loses Inhofe's support, I mean, that's a pretty clear sign that Pruitt's on his way out. But for now, he has that.
We will continue to keep an eye on Scott Pruitt because that guy will always be in the headlines, I'm pretty sure, as long as he's in office. Don, let's talk about the energy industry. One of our local companies here is kind of taking its own path here. What's up with Continental?
Yeah, well, we recently just had earnings from most of our big energy companies, and we're continuing to see a trend that we've seen before, which is even though oil prices are higher, a lot of these companies are really taking an opportunity to buy back stock, to pay down debt, because shareholders are sort of fed up because energy stocks haven't been a part of this recent rally of the stock market. So energy companies trying to placate their shareholders. Now you've got Continental Resources, which really only has one important shareholder, and that's Harold Hamm. He owns most of the stock in Continental. So Continental has announced, as they release their earnings, that they are instituting a massive drilling project in Grady County. It's called Springboard. They are going to basically line up 4 drilling rigs up to 9 miles from one end to the other, and then drill one well after another. And they say they're going to drill hundreds of wells in Grady County. So, and the prices are good. I mean, oil's well over $60 a barrel, has been for a while now. They have a lot of infrastructure already in place down there so they can get the stuff to market. It's not far from there to Cushing, which is where they set the price for West Texas Intermediate crude oil. and they're planning to drill, baby, drill.
Does Continental always kind of play, are they always kind of a strategy a little different given that Harold Hamm is the sole owner that way? I mean, are they,
yes.
they just...
That does make a difference, and they have always been, and Harold Hamm founded this company. I mean, the guy started driving a truck in the oil fields, and he has always been an oil guy. He doesn't care a lot about natural gas. So they are heavy into oil, and this is the time that's a really profitable place to be. Some of our other energy companies, they're trying to get more into oil in their portfolio, you know, produce more oil, maybe less natural gas. But Harold's always been an oil guy.
Harold, another benefactor of Scott Pruitt, right? Another strong backer of Pruitt's.
And another frequent visitor to the legislature, too. He was sitting in the
gallery.
Yeah, he would sit in the gallery when they were taking some votes on the gross production tax, which actually came up during the earnings for Continental, as they pointed out that Oklahoma raised its gross production tax, but they were not going to change their guidance on how much tax they would owe, even though Oklahoma has raised its gross production tax.
And we've talked about this before, that the argument that takes place in Oklahoma about the discussion of the gross production tax, when Wall Street looks at that issue or whatever, it's nothing to them, right?
It's almost a non-starter, but they at least mentioned it.
When we say non-starter in terms of, it's economically insignificant.
Right. And they often don't even report it because they don't have to report things that aren't monetarily significant. In this case, they did say Oklahoma's raised their gross production tax. We're not changing our guidance that we issued earlier on how much our tax liabilities are going to be in the coming year.
And yet that debate ties the legislature in knots.
It does.
Over what Wall Street considers insignificant. Strange.
Yeah.
We don't care about the Northerners.
Anyway, that's the kind of insight, news, information we bring you every day of the year. Pick up a paper, check us out online, newsok.com, theoklahoman.com. We'll see you next week.